This is a squat. And this is a hinge. So in the squat, we're gonna see deep knee flexion and hip flexion. And the hips are gonna track up and down. In the hinge, we're gonna have a soft knee bend, so we'll see less knee flexion, deep hip flexion, and the hips are gonna track more posteriorly or backwards. So a couple of key differences to understand about the squat movement pattern and the hip hinge movement pattern include, number one, in the squat, we're going to have deeper knee flexion. This means we're going to have more quad involvement because the quads are going to be acting upon the knee to extend the knee. We are also going to be moving the hips and pelvis through a more vertical path of movement. Now in the hip hinge, we're going to be primarily relying on posterior muscles. So muscles on the back, the glutes, the hamstrings, even the calves are going to be involved. Now on that topic, the hips, instead of moving more vertically like in the squat, they're going to be moving in a much more horizontal basis. So if you are somebody who doesn't feel their hamstrings, for example, in the hip hinge, my guess is that you might be traveling a little bit too vertically and you may not be creating length in the hamstrings by shifting the hips posteriorly. But now, let's talk about a couple of faults to avoid with the hip hinge and how to actually do it. So to execute great hip hinges, you're going to adapt a soft knee bend. You're going to think about pushing those hips backwards. And a cue that I like to use is to think as though there's a string pulling those hips directly backwards. Now, a lot of times beginners will go too deep into knee flexion when trying to hinge, and you'll have a lot of vertical movement pattern with the hips. So what are some progressions that true beginners can use to master the hip hinge? So the first step for mastering the hip hinge is to practice a couple of dowel hinges. You can use a Swiffer like us, a broomstick, a yardstick, whatever you have is okay. Now what you're going to do here to practice this skill is you are going to hold the implement on the back, and you're going to try to keep contact with the hips, upper back, and head as you hinge. So as you can see, like when Nikki hinges here, she's able to maintain all these points of contact. Now, a couple things to think about. If you are a beginner who is doing their hip hinge and let's say they're rounding the thoracic a lot, what will end up happening is your head will come off of contact with the stick or your low upper back will as well. And if you are squatting your hinge, what will end up happening is you may keep all the contact, but if you watch the posterior part of the implement, it'll travel towards the earth. Whereas if we do a correct hinge with this movement pattern and tip, that implement will travel upwards. It's gonna almost do like a swing versus traveling down in the squat movement pattern. Now the next progression you can try once you master the dowel hinge is to use your walls. So the next progression we're gonna do is the wall hinge. So what Nikki is going to do is she's going to put her heels, butt, and back against the wall. Then she's gonna step out 1 foot length away from the wall with both feet. Perfect. Now what she's gonna do here, she's going to focus on hinging, pushing those hips back, and using that wall as a reference point in which she will stand back up. So she's gonna hinge backwards, make contact with that wall, stand back up, and extend the hips. This is a great drill to do to help you understand what it's like to push the hips backwards and use a point of reference for when to stand back up. Generally, 1 foot length is going to be your best bet just because once we take further steps away, if we don't have the range, what ends up happening is we end up sitting back way too far and we end up falling into the wall. So 1 foot length will usually be your best bet with this one. But now let's dive into the third progression. So the third progression we are going to do is going to involve a box and the wall once again. Now, ideally, you're going to want to find a box or an implement that will sit below the knee joint and will be around 1 foot length. This is a little bit longer than Nikki's. It's okay. We'll see how it works. But the point with this is that now that we've done our initial test to actually push the hips back and feel the wall, we're going to focus on maintaining contact with this box and her calves and repeat this process. This is going to help Nikki then understand what it's like to keep a softer, more vertical shin length and knee bend versus allowing those knees to flex too much and track forward. So let's go through a couple reps here. So she's focusing on maintaining contact here, hitting the hips against the wall, and repeating that process. Now it is important to note that if there is some forward knee tracking with your hinge, that is okay. It's gonna depend on how you're physically loading this movement. But if you are somebody who tends to flex too much at the ankle and shift those knees forward, this can be a really great progression for you. All right, so now you're feeling spicy. You think you have the hip hinge on lock. Now it's time to start loading. So the first progression we are going to do is it's going to be a kettlebell RDL with a limited range of motion. And there's a rationale for this. So a lot of times as beginners, when we start doing RDLs, we start doing a lot of hip hinging exercises, we think that we need more range than we typically do. So what ends up happening is we try to go so low, hit the floor, and we get a lot of knee bend, we take away a lot of the work from the glutes and hamstrings. So what we're gonna do is have Nick do a kettlebell RDL on a yoga block. And what she's going to do then is she's gonna pick up that kettlebell, perfect, and then she's going to go down and use that block as a point of reference for when to come back up. Now the height of what you're going to use to set your kettlebell down or your implement or your weight on is gonna vary. Obviously, if you have less range, you'd wanna use a higher point of contact, so you'd wanna raise that up, and then she would use that then as a point of contact. But overall, what she's gonna think about is hinging backwards, keeping length in the hamstrings, keeping the weight somewhat close to the body, and using that external surface as a point of reference for when to extend the hips and return to a standing setup. So the next progression we're going to discuss in this video is that now we are ready to move through full range of motion with an external load. We're going to use an interior load to do so. The reason why I start most beginners when they're trying to learn how to hip hinge with an interior load is because if we use dumbbells and kettlebells, at times what we can think about is what we're doing with our lats way too much. And if we're just focused on hugging a weight here, so oftentimes I will use a sandbag or a med ball, we just get to focus on our hinge. We're holding the weight here. We're not gonna round because it's gonna feel really awkward to do so. We're not gonna go into greater lumbar extension because it's just gonna feel very uncomfortable when we're hugging that weight. So by holding an interior load here, we can fully focus on our hip hinge and creating length at the hamstrings. So she's gonna hinge back, focus on creating length here and feeling a stretch. And then once she feels like she's about to round over and drop that front load, she is going to stand back up by extending the hips. This is one of my favorite progressions and variations for beginners who are trying to master the hinge. I want to limit as much thought as I can for managing the load you are given and have you just primarily rely on what the hips are doing to create length at the hamstrings. All right guys, that wraps up this beginner focused hip hinge video. Big thank you to Nikki for being my model and the dogs for coming in and out and ruining clips pretty frequently. But if you guys have any questions on this topic, hit me in the comments below. I wanted to basically make a very beginner friendly video for mastering the hip hinge and understanding some progression. So if you have any questions, hit me. And as always guys, drop a like to the video, drop a subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next one. And before we take it out, I will say I'll link Nikki's channel down below. And also shout out to Jamar, AKA Pancake God, for the gear. He is one of our good friends, a great dude. Check him out. I'll also link his channel down below. Peace guys. Thank you.